Okay, so should we care? So a couple of reasons why we might not care that much that inequality is increased. Concerning? Maybe. Um, so one is income mobility. So what this paper does, Otten, Gee, and Turner do, is they look at your income inequality, or whatever, if you, within a person, um, from age 35 to 40 and 55 to 60, and they make a transition matrix where if you're in the lowest quintile, the bottom 20% in 1987, when you're 35 to 40, what's the probability that you are in the, I couldn't believe it was 20 years between 1987 and 2007, um, uh, still in the lowest quintile? Well, half of those guys are still in the lowest quintile. 75% are in the bottom two, but some fraction of them, 5%, end up in the top quintile. Similarly, among those who are in the highest quintile, 35 to 40, only 50% of them stay. Significant fraction of them fall. So another way to put it is just they're even within lifetimes. I would have thought that this would be not a diagonal matrix, but basically a diagonal matrix of 100, 100, 100, 100, 100. But this is to say, let's say I'm 35 to 40 in the middle quintile. I have a 15% chance. Perfectly fair society would be it wouldn't even be fair because this is within person. You're already 35 to 40 earning in the middle, but in a totally random society, it would be 20% for that guy. And it's in fact 14%, like 75% of the way there to a perfectly random society. For these guys, you would not have a lot of reason to think that the lowest quintile would ever get into the top quintile. From 35 to 40, so this is like past schooling age for the most part. For the most part. But those from 51 who are in the bottom quintile still have a 5% chance. That's like a quarter of the way for them towards a perfectly random society. Okay, so there's still a lot of within person mobility. What about across person, parental to child? Well, even if I'm 35 to 40, I have some chance of making it to the top, and not an insignificant chance. It's just my chance has fallen by 75% if I spent my 30s, late 30s as a relatively low earner. It reduces my chances of getting the top 20% by 75%. I'm shocked it's that small of a decline. But you have the right to have your own opinion. Oh, and one other thing, what's probably you get in the top 1%? Well, I guess I won't talk about that. Well, what about parent to child income inequality? Well, if your parent was in the lowest income quintile, in a perfectly fair society where there is no inheritable talent, everybody's the same, then all of these should have a 20 in them. So their deviation from 20 is going to be a measure of mobility inequality. If I have a parent that's born in the lowest quintile, so I'm born in the bottom 20%, that less than doubles my chance. Like 1.5, this should be 20% ideally, right? But it increases my chances by 13%. Alternatively, it roughly halves. It a little bit more than halves my chance of making in the top 20%. Now, I should have had you guess what your numbers for this would. If you had a parent who was in the bottom 20%, what's the chance you make in the top 20%? I would have guessed, 1%. So this is a dramatic change in what I would have guessed. Now it is not 20%, which is what you want is if you had an egalitarian society where everybody is born equal. But this is still, even if you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, top 20%, but silver spoon in your mouth, you have it less than halves your chance of falling into the bottom 20% when you're an adult. So it's just to say, income inequality is inherited, but I'm shocked at the mobility in the United States even today. Now, great. Why might you still be concerned about this? I said, maybe you're not so concerned. There's incredible mobility within person. There's incredible, to me, this is opinion, incredible mobility across generations. But if you look at the so-called Great Gatsby curve, it says, but when you have more income inequality, that seems to be correlated with less mobility. So one of the reasons the United States seems to have less mobility than, say, Finland is because we have more income inequality. So this makes sense. I invest an enormous amount in my daughter and my son, in part because there is great income inequality in the United States. What their human capital is really matters. And so as a consequence, people are going to invest that, there's a rat race or whatever. And and if you are well off or you're already intelligent, you have a leg up. And as a consequence, you would expect higher income inequality is going to give some people the ability to invest in their children and other people not. And in fact, you do see less mobility as a consequence of that. That's a concern, right? What else? Why should we care? Well, then we start getting to a cool result from the World Income Inequality Database. A lot of the time we were just talking about this pre-tax income inequality. And the reason we were talking about pre-tax is because that's kind of what the market is dictating. But if we think, well, if we care about inequality, do we care about pre-tax? That's like labor market stuff. Economists maybe should care about that. But shouldn't we as policymakers care about post-tax inequality? And when you do that, these two are the same. Like you can see this black line here is going to become dotted. So what happens to, and you can see its original source here. So what happens when you go from pre-tax to post-tax shares, it suddenly changes dramatically. So what are the two dramatic changes? Well, previously that green line and the black line were crossing sometime in 1997. Oops, excuse me. Now the green line has not yet crossed the black line. In other words, once you take in tax into account, the bottom 50% have not lost nearly as much ground as we thought. And the top 1% has not gained nearly as much ground. Before, it looked like they gained 10%. Here, they've gained 5%. Similarly, it looked like the bottom 50% had lost, from 24% or 22% to 12%, like 10 percentage points. Now it looks like they've lost, 2.5. And so they've still lost ground, but it severely mitigates the concerns we might have. So, yeah, there's nothing much else to say other than maybe, should we care about it? Well, maybe our system is already doing some of its job. It's the taxes on the poor have versus the rich have really mitigated the rise in income inequality, which is the sort of thing you want. Why else might you not be concerned about this? And the reason I'm saying why you might not be concerned about this, other than the Great Gatsby curve, is that I think there's clear reason to be concerned about this. So I want to push back against that. So what this is from Kaplan and Raw, where they looked at the Forbes 400. And it used to be in 400 richest Americans. It used to be in 1982 that only 40% of the Forbes 400 richest Americans were first generation, the first people in their family in there. Now it's about 75%. And similarly, it used to be a significant fraction of them were sixth generation. Now none of them are. It used to be a lot of them are fifth generation. Now none of them are. Significant fraction of fourth generation. Now very few are. Significant fraction of third generation, and now very few of them are. You get the idea. That in fact, basically, the only thing that's risen, as far as I can tell, from 82 to 11 is first generation, Forbes 400. So if you're concerned about inherited wealth, all the Waltons and the, all the inherited Rockefellers and stuff like that, well, there's reason to think that's not actually what's happening in the very top incomes. All those guys seem to be first generation. We're talking about like Jeff Bezos or something like that. Presumably Bill Gates. I don't know who his father was, but I don't think he was rich. That's what we're seeing here. Warren Buffett or whatever. That's what we're seeing here is people whose families were not rich. Which one reason people are concerned about income inequality is like the deep unfairness of it all. And maybe it's unfair, but it's not unfair because these guys were born into the Forbes 400 and stayed there. In fact, that is far less true today than it was in 1982 and in 1992 and even in 2001. So that's encouraging. We're more meritocratic than we used to be. And you can also, you might say, yeah, okay. Yeah, they're not in the Forbes 400, but maybe they grew up wealthy. And it turns out that it used to be the majority grew up wealthy, and now far fewer of them did. Although it's still true that 30% of the Forbes 400 grew up wealthy, whatever wealthy means. You can look at Kaplan and Raw. More of them grew up with some wealth. I don't know what that means. But you can look at Kaplan and Raw. I just don't recall. My own work, which I guess I will skip, tries to look at how much of income inequality is due to taste rather than talent, and finds that there's a significant role for taste to. So the idea here is that I like spending time with my kids, as it turns out. That is part of the reason I became a professor. Other people I know really like making money. And as a consequence, they chose jobs in which they make money. Now, it would be crazy to transfer from them, and they make far more than me, like 10 times more. No, not 10. Yeah, 10, something like 10 times more in some year than me, in a good year where they get bonuses. Now, would it be fair to transfer that from them to me? It's not so clear. I'm inclined to think I'm actually getting more utility than them. Maybe that's sour grapes, but I chose that because I enjoy my lifestyle, right? And so what we tried to look at is how much of income inequality is due to that. And we found that the data really points to a large role for taste in income heterogeneity. I'm not going to talk about that paper very much, but that's where my research is, in case you're curious. The coolest research in this is by Chicago Harris's very own Bruce Meyer, as well as James X. Sullivan at Notre Dame, where they say, no. We started this lecture by saying, what happened to wealth inequality? No, we shouldn't care about wealth inequality. We care about income inequality, pre-tax income inequality. No. Maybe we shouldn't care about pre-tax income inequality. We care about post-tax income inequality. What Bruce is going to say is, no. Maybe we shouldn't care about post-tax inequality. We should care about what people consume. What about transfers? And we should care about what people are able to consume, not just what they are even making as income. And there, just like going from wealth to pre-tax income inequality dramatically reduces inequality, but it's the thing we care about more, presumably. And going from pre-tax inequality to post-tax inequality, again, dramatically reduces the increase in income inequality, and it's presumably something we care about. Really, we don't care about post-tax income inequality necessarily. Maybe we do because people have dignity, stuff like that. But what we might care about instead is consumption. And consumption, let's look at it. They're gonna use the Consumer Expenditure Survey. They're gonna say, what's happened to after-tax money income between the 90th percentile and the 50th percentile? It's increased dramatically. That's the sort of thing we saw. But what's happened to consumption? Well-measured consumption. The increase as a percent, I don't have as good a graph here, but the increase, let me put the good graph in here real quick, or I'll just find it and talk about it. Okay, so here's the graph. As you can see, this is for the 90-10 rather than 90-50, because it's just going to be much more stark. The 90-10 income ratio has gone from 4.5, it used to be the 90th percentile and 4.5 times as much as the 10th percentile, has gone to 7.0, a dramatic increase, right? Not quite doubling, it would have to go up to 9 to double, but a fairly large increase. So the 90th percentile is have gained far more than the 10th percentile in terms of their income. But when you look at their consumption ratios reported in the Consumer Expenditure Survey, they have not changed at all, essentially. Maybe they've increased just a little bit. But so here's the core claim that I take away from Meyer and Sullivan, which is just totally wild. Just totally wild, which is if before you think we should raise taxes, we should raise transfer programs, we should fix all this, we need a UBI, you should think about what is our tax and transfer program doing already? And what is it already doing its job? And the answer is potentially yes. There has been a dramatic rise in income inequality between the 10th percentile and 90th percentile, but that has not shown up at all in consumption. I don't want to talk about, we can talk about welfare stigma, but people's consumption hasn't changed. even as the market works or whatever, if the market's working, if this isn't just corruption or something, the market works. If it's still by technological change, we're getting productivity, but the poorest among us are not suffering in terms of consumption. Now, maybe they're suffering in other ways, self-esteem, suicide rates, or something like that, but they're certainly not, the evidence isn't that their consumption inequality is rising dramatically. It is not that consumption inequality is rising dramatically, which is really something. Maybe our welfare state is already doing its job, which is encouraging. It's, in my opinion, something that both conservatives and potentially liberals can hate. It's the sort of thing it gives me my jollies for some reason, which is the claim essentially is that the welfare state is working. Now, this should make conservatives who don't like the welfare state unhappy, because the claim is not necessarily hurting people in terms of their consumption. For instance, they're not working, dramatically less to even cut consumption. It potentially makes liberals angry. If they want to expand the welfare state, then this is reason to say, it's already worked as it was supposed to. Now, of course, everybody has there are counter arguments to that, but it's a really remarkable finding from my perspective. Okay, now my response, just as an aside, should we care, is finance all a waste? And so it's worth noting the U.S. productive capital stock is about $57 trillion. So my opinion was like, how could it possibly be valuable? So I did this back in the envelope calculation. So if you had two firms with 11% and 6% cost of capital, so they're going to choose their marginal product of capitals, they're going to choose their capital levels inefficiently, in the sense that one of them is going to choose it pretty high. Excuse me. This guy's going to choose a high capital level. This guy's going to choose a too low capital level. If only we had a financial system that could switch it so their rates of return were the same. So I carved out this framework. How much does this kind of small inefficiency in our finance system cost us? Well, it would cost us about 9% of GDP if instead of having an 11% firm, marginal return to capital firm, and a 6% marginal return to capital, they were both whatever, 9% or whatever the median is. If you had two firms with Cobb-Douglas production technology, you could gain total production about 9% by giving from the firm that's using it inefficiently and taking from the firm that's using it inefficiently and giving to the firm that's using it that has too little. You could increase GDP by about 9% in some simple Cobb-Douglas framework, about 1.5 trillion. By contrast, fire insurance is about 7.6% GDP. So here's the claim. Our productive capital stock is enormous. And if finance even plays a relatively small role in reducing gaps, increasing the efficiency of capital allocation, it can easily pay for itself. And the reason is just because they're playing around with a stock and fixing it, just a very large stock. And so we're fixing allocations of that stock can generate massive gains because the stock is $57 trillion that can easily pay for their share of GDP. That's not to say they're necessarily doing it, but if you're trying to figure out how it could possibly be worth 9% of GDP, that's my answer, is, if they could solve this sort of a difficulty, and we see larger differences in the marginal product of capital when we look at developing countries without advanced financial systems, there's reason to think that this could potentially be a big deal, I should say. So finance is important. So even if it's just rearranging capital allocation, it can be worth literally trillions of dollars, $1.5 trillion by my count. So that's a big deal. So what are my takeaways from all this? And I think I tried to push against the zeitgeist, but I think everything seems to be working fine. The welfare state is working, and that consumption inequality hasn't been growing. The Forbes 400 is more meritocratic rather than less. Kind of considering post-tax income, the bottom 50% are still more economically powerful than the top 1%, although it's true that their power is diminished. The 50th to 99th percentile, the middle class, plus any other group has more than half the income in the United States. So it's like when we're thinking about purchasing power or plutocracy, that's worth noting that the middle class can easily outspend all the Bezoses and Oprahs and J.K. Rowling's, if she's still a billionaire, whatever. Moreover, it's still true, this is more opinion, within lifetime and intergenerational mobility are still high. What high means is up to you. It's certainly not perfectly egalitarian, but it's more than half of the way there. I didn't talk about it, so I won't talk about it, but personal tastes seem to play a role in inequality that we don't account for in most of our optimal tax models. But there are some important warnings in all this. Wealth inequality has risen by more than this. If we care about wealth inequality, and I think you have to make the case that we should, we may be much more alarmed. More inequality, the Great Gatsby curve, is going to say more inequality is associated with less mobility. So maybe this whole thing is a time bomb where, yeah, sure, inequality is increased now. In 30 years from now, it's going to mean even less mobility and more intergenerational inequality, and this whole thing's going to blow up. That's bad. There's still a strong decline in the bottom 50% share. Even though it's mitigated by taxes, there's still a strong decline. That's a concern. And if it's moreover, there's reason to think that it might be the tip of the iceberg. So this isn't about income inequality. It's not even about consumption. It's about, these deaths of despairs and Angus and Deaton's, not Angus and Deaton, Case and Deaton's words. That's just like throwing, he talked to Anne, you hear Anne talk about the injustice that's done to her when people, Angus Deaton and Anne Case are husband and wife. They're both good economists. Angus won the Nobel Prize, and then news articles would say things like Deaton and co-author, or Deaton and wife get write book and stuff like that. It's like, she's a good economist. She's a Princeton. She's a good economist in her own right. And so for me to say Angus and Deaton is just throwing fuel on the fire. But in any case, there are reasons to think maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg, and we don't care about anything I just talked about, even consumption, because there's pride, there's ability, there's community. We're coming apart, and I don't have as much to say about that. I just think that a lot of what we talk about for income inequality is full of misinformation, and I hope that I pushed back against that misinformation. So my conclusion. You're free to disagree. This is my actual thoughts on the topic, especially highlighting things that I was surprised by when I actually started looking at myself, is that income inequality has risen. That's deeply troubling. Minimum wages, declining unions, lower top tax rates, skill bias, technological change, all seem to have played a role. They all explain, 70%. How can we fix it? I think we have to think about the least costly ways to do it. And I think policy levers like the minimum wage, the EITC, which I didn't talk about, but we can, corporate governance are likely better routes than taxes or unions, although honest people, I think, can disagree about that. How much of a problem is the rise in income inequality? Well, in terms of consumption alone, it does not seem to be a problem. That's Meyer and Sullivan's paper. It's consumption inequality hasn't risen, even as income inequality has. Our welfare system works. This is like good news. But it's worth keeping an eye on intergenerational mobility because of the Great Gatsby curve, because you're concerned that this whole thing's going to blow up in our faces. It hasn't yet in terms of consumption inequality, but it could. And there could be other ways in which this thing is showing up. Deaths of despair. You might be concerned about oligarchy. You might be concerned about marriage inequality or sex inequality. There's less I have to say about that. So that's kind of my take, my iconoclastic take on inequality for you. Thanks.